As you know, psychological suspense is one of the hardest words to say. No, is one of the hottest genres right now. I've lost count of how many of these books I've read over the last few years. So trust me when I say that our next two authors are two of the very best writers in the genre. Both are breakout bestsellers, and it's clear why. Their novels are complicated and twisty, with narrators who may or may not be telling the truth. Ruth Ware is the author of In a Dark, Dark Wood and The Woman in Cabin 10. Her new novel, The Lying Game, will be published in July. Megan Miranda is the author of All the Missing Girls, which just came out in paperback. Her new novel, The Perfect Stranger, comes out next month. Ruth and Megan will be in conversation with Elisabeth Egan, books editor at Glamour Magazine, and author of the novel A Window Opens. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Megan Miranda, Ruth Ware. I'm so excited to be talking to both of you, not only because I've enjoyed the time that we've spent together in the green room, it gives me great pleasure to say that, but also because I was one of those kids who discovered Mary Higgins Clark, a fellow Simon & Schuster author, when other little girls were reading Judy Blume. And it wasn't because I was gifted, it was because I love a dark story, and I love the twistiness that Wendy was just describing, and all of your books fit the bill. So I wanted to start with a question that, well, you'll see where I'm going with this, but both of you have published books summer after summer, sort of the Irish twin equivalent of books. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you get your very first. What is the germ of the idea of each of those books? And also, if each of you could walk us through a little bit of your writing routine. And I'll start with Ruth. You're in the hot seat.
No pressure. First question. It's a really difficult question to answer because the truth is all of my books have come to me in very different ways. In a Dark, Dark Wood was a conversation with a friend who I owe several drinks to, where we were both big kind of crime and thriller readers, and she was saying that she had never read a thriller set on a hen night or a bachelorette party, and as soon as she said it, I was just like, no, I've never read one either, and I don't know why not, because it feels like it would be the perfect setting. And literally on the way home from this conversation, I was like, these characters were walking on inside my head, and I think by the time I got to my tube stop, I knew that this was a book I was going to write. But my second book, The Woman in Cabin 10, came to me completely differently. And it's a scene about a third of the way into the book where the main character wakes up and she does that thing. We probably all do it, where you wake up in the middle of the night because you've heard a noise and your heart is going a mile a minute and you're not sure what you've heard, but you know that there is something wrong. And she's lying in bed and she's listening and she hears the screen door. She's on a boat. She hears the screen door of the cabin next to her open, and she hears something being thrown overboard. And she rushes to her own window and looks over the balcony, and she sees what she thinks is a body disappearing into the waves. And that scene just came to me, and the rest of the book kind of had to be slotted in around it. So, but I'm very curious to hear about yours.
Yeah, my answer is a little bit the same, that it comes from different pieces depending on the book. For All the Missing Girls, I first had the idea of the structure. I had been interested in this idea of telling a mystery in reverse, where you're walking back through the pieces, but I didn't have the right story for it. And where I came up with the right story was on a very long car ride. I grew up in New Jersey, and I moved to North Carolina about a decade ago. And if you're not familiar with the joys of this car ride, it's about 10 and a half hours long. And as we were doing this drive, it's one where the scenery just changes so dramatically as you go, and I got this vision of a girl doing the reverse, and she was seeing pieces of her past as she went, and so I first wrote that scene, which was in All the Missing Girls when Nick drives home to visit her family in North Carolina. So it kind of came from a character and a structure. And then for The Perfect Stranger, it actually came from a piece of the setting. When I was growing up, my grandparents had this really little cabin in the Poconos where we would go visit. And it was really fun to go visit, and I have great family memories there, but it was also super creepy at night. Like, we're in the middle of the woods, and at night I'd be sitting there like, I don't know what that noise was. And so I basically started with The Perfect Stranger with this idea of the house. So yes.
Tell me a little bit about your process when you're working on a book. I read in an interview with Gillian Flynn that she works in a basement office and doesn't bring any of her work upstairs ever. She keeps all the darkness in the basement. And I was wondering how you navigate the dark place when you're writing these very suspenseful stories, how you balance that with your daily lives.
Well, my office is our spare bedroom, so I guess you could say I keep all my darkness in the spare bedroom. So that is lovely for our guests. But no, I do. I mean, one of the great privileges of, selling a few books and things has been able to kind of ring fence a bit of my life. Before, I was always writing, kind of juggling around the kids, and, there would be CBeebies blaring in the background, and being able to just afford a bit of childcare and have a space that's just for my writing is just like, it's a privilege that I just am thankful for every single day and will never take for granted. But yeah, I write when my kids are at school, and I try to kind of, leave it at the door when they come home. Not because of the darkness, because I don't know, I don't think my novels are that dark. Maybe they are. But more just because I think, we all need time to decompress, and working from home, there is a real risk that your work just bleeds over into every area of your life and you just never stop. Do you find the same thing?
I do, and what's really funny is that my office is also in the spare bedroom. Just
basically never be our guest.
If you have guests, do you not work?
I move it's like a corner of the spare bedroom, and I move like my whiteboard and my laptop down into my bedroom when I have guests, but there's still kind of remnants of my office there. But I used to write, my kids are 8 and 10 now, and I started writing when they were 1 and 3, and I had these like light blocking shades in their bedrooms, and I'd put them to bed at like 6:45 at night. I was like, it's bedtime, everybody.
All writers have that in common.
Yes. And so I used to only write at night, and it felt like, it kind of went with the feel of the book. It was dark and it was creepy.
A little wine, maybe.
Yes, definitely. And now they're in school, they're 8 and 10, and I can't put them to bed at 6:45 anymore, so I write during school hours.
They look at the clock, don't they?
Yes.
They're like, hang on a minute, I think you're fine.
Yes. So I do, but I do like to keep, my laptop in the office, because I used to, when you work from home, it is easy to kind of bring your laptop with you everywhere you go. And so what I try to do is at 3 p.m., I close the door to the spare bedroom/office, and I leave my laptop there, and I leave the story there, and I kind of go enter the rest of my day.
When you're preparing for an interview like this, you listen to a million podcasts with the author you're talking to, and you do a million Google searches. So I have a dossier on each of you. And one of the questions that comes up again and again in these kind of interviews is the question of what do you read while you're working on your books? And I was very touched to find, Megan, that in one of the podcasts that I listened to with you, you recommended one of Ruth's books. So I was wondering, what were you reading with your most recent books as you were working on them, if you remember? And also maybe what writers have influenced you in a big way.
I feel like you should go first, because I've gone first on the last 2 questions.
Okay,
so
yeah.
I'll think of my answer while you're...
I do. I read very widely across the board, and so sometimes when I'm working on my thriller, I don't always read the same type of genre just to make sure nothing else is kind of getting in my head. But I am drawn to the darker side of fiction. I love Ruth Ware's books, and I loved the second, and I'm looking forward to the third book as well. But yeah, I'm trying to think what I was working on during The Perfect Stranger, or what I was reading.
The thing is, a book takes a year to write, so it's really difficult to kind of pin down. I tend to find when I start writing, I like Megan. I try to not read stuff that's too close, because I think it's that. Oftentimes, finding the voice of a character is a lot like trying to listen to two conversations, and one is real life, and the other conversation is the conversation that your character is trying to have with you. And it's very easy for it to be drowned out by all the other voices in your life of, your kids and your partners and the news and everything else that's going on. And you have to find enough kind of stillness to listen to that other voice and try and work out what they're trying to say. So yeah, when I'm sort of starting off a project, I do try not to read anything too similar, and I go back to old friends and reread books that I've been reading since childhood, or sometimes things that are just in a completely different genre. I'm a big fan of Patrick O'Brian, the seafaring Napoleonic novels, because they're just nothing to do with my books. But yeah, once I'm going, I read other books, and I'm often very jealous. I read All the Missing Girls and was like, damn it, the backwards. So why didn't I think of that? I think jealousy is a very healthy emotion. I've just read one by Erin Kelly called He Said, She Said. And I can't really explain too much about it without spoiling it, but the structure of that is just brilliant. Yeah. I think as a writer, I think that's the highest compliment you can pay someone else's book, is that feeling of, why didn't I get there first? But I do like reading. I've just read your book, which was wonderful, and that was lovely because I read so much crime, because I get sent so much crime. It was just lovely to read something that wasn't about people being killed or maimed or
There's no crime in my book.
kidnapped.
But with the kind of books that I write, I think that the character comes to me first before the question at the center of the book. And I always imagine with suspense that the scenario or the location, the suspense must come to you before the character. Is that true? And yet your books have these very well-drawn characters who stick with you once you're finished reading. So I was curious which
Mine
comes first.
it's not so much the suspense or the plot or exactly what happens, but sometimes there's a theme that I'm really interested in exploring, and I feel that kind of goes hand in hand with the suspense sometimes. So for All the Missing Girls, I was interested in this idea of disappearing, that there are the characters who disappear, who walk into the woods and don't come back out, but that there's also versions of ourselves who might be able to disappear, and if they still exist inside ourselves. So I start with a character and a theme and a setting actually first, and the plot for me comes last. I'm not somebody who can see a whole plot when I start a book. I'll maybe see what happens at 25%, and then I'll write to that part and then realize, okay, well now I know what's at the 50% mark. And then by the time I get to the 50% mark, I'm like, please let me know what happens at the end. But I kind of write in sections like that and develop as I go.
That surprises me so much, because the structure of All the Missing Girls, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's told backwards. I would have assumed...
Like 12 drafts.
Okay, that kind of reassures me a little bit. I guess, well, the book that I've just finished editing, which is called The Lying Game, that was the one book where the setting came to me first. And it came from a holiday in France, and I literally visited the village that's in the book. And on the way out, I drove past this tide mill, and it was on this kind of salt marsh, I guess, with this narrow causeway road that I was driving across, and the sun was rising as I was going past, and the water was all kind of flames. It was so beautiful. And in the background, there was this kind of great ruined hulk of a building that you could see had once been really important, and it was just kind of literally crumbling into the sea. And I knew, this was about 4 or 5 years ago, I knew that I would end up putting it in a book, but it just took me a while to find the book. But in terms of plotting, see, I guess I don't see the kind of this, what happens as separate from the character, because, well, I guess all books, but crime in particular, motive has to come from character, and that influences what you do and how you react to it. So I guess they kind of all come at the same time in a weird kind of way. But I do plot a little bit, mostly only when my editors make me.
And when we were talking backstage, people always ask, do you do an outline? And it sounds like neither of you are outliners, but you are thinking a few steps ahead.
I liken it to a journey. Like, you know where you're going to start, you know where you want to get to, and you might know a few of the things that you hope to see along the way, but the actual route that you take, and you can be derailed by all sorts of things, or you might see something interesting in the different distance and kind of take a shortcut or whatever. All of that is up for grabs.
Yeah.
What's on your whiteboard? You mentioned that you had a whiteboard.
I don't have a whiteboard.
I know. That's so professional.
No, it's because I don't do a lot of plotting, so I need to leave myself notes when I actually figure something out as I'm going.
Yes.
So I have a lot of notes there, and I have a lot of sticky notes that I'll think of, I have a scene that I see later on, and I'll put a sticky note, and I'll be like, I'll figure out where that will go later down the line.
And do you write in order?
Usually. So I usually write in the order, that you're reading. But usually I'll come up with pieces of the backstory as I go, and then I'll have to figure out where.
Slot it in.
Yeah. So
I'm always really shocked. Some writers go through and write all the fun scenes first, and I feel like that's really cheating. That's like picking all the pepperoni off your pizza, and then you're like,
Yes.
okay, now I've got to eat the crust.
I feel like you have to wait for those so you reward
you have to
yourself.
earn them, otherwise
Right through the hard scenes, and then you know what's coming,
Exactly.
and it's the reward at the end.
I wanted to touch on what I think of as the elephant in the room of every writer, which is the revision process. You mentioned that you revised 12 times. Talk to me about that. How do you get yourself motivated to do it? Who is your first reader? How are you, what is your process for revising, and how do you not become completely frustrated?
Well, for me, when I start a revision, I try to break down all the different points that have to be addressed. And so I think, okay, these are plot issues and these are character issues, and what's kind of the heart of the story that has to remain. And I have a lot of readers along the way that I use. I have other authors, and we share our manuscripts, and I'll usually do that before I send it to my agent and then to my editor. And so I get all of their feedback along the way. And so the first thing I have to tell myself is we're all on the same side and want this to be the best book that it can be. And then I make like a list on my whiteboard sometimes.
It comes in handy.
And then I just really start fresh a lot of times. I think it helps to start with a fresh draft, and then you can still pull in the pieces that you're keeping, but to kind of have that openness that this is a new version and let's see where it takes us.
I don't work like that at all. And I really hope this doesn't make everyone hate me, but I don't really revise. I'd say 99% of the book that when I write the end, 99% of that is what goes to my editor.
This is how you've achieved the Irish twin cadence of your books.
Well, that's slightly overstating it, because I do revise as I go along, and I will, I tend to start each kind of writing day by reading what I wrote the previous day. So very often at that stage, I'll weed out things that don't work. And I've got quite good at knowing when I'm going down a blind alley, because sometimes, you'll start writing a scene and you'll get quite a long way before you realise actually that's not what is supposed to be happening. And I can usually double back and change that at the time. That's not to say, like, after I've handed it in, obviously my editor has suggestions and changes, and there's usually like a couple of rounds of structural edits, but no, pretty much
that's it.
Pretty much when I write it, that's what goes off, yeah.
That's amazing. And then how quickly do both of you switch gears and begin a new book?
I usually start a new book the day I start thinking about a new book before I've handed in my previous draft, and then I usually start it the day I hand in my draft. But then there's usually a 2-month hiatus while I do the edits on the previous book. Wow. But that's quite healthy, because then I sit there I'm desperate to get back to these characters that I've started to fall in love with, and this book is now dead to me. It's like, which is quite a healthy way to go into sending a new book out into the world, because it's a really scary thing, ultimately it is like having someone read your diary or, rummage through your knicker drawer or whatever. It's a very personal part of you. And the only way that I can find to give myself enough distance to feel okay about that process is to have started a new book and then the new book is my baby.
I actually do the same. I start my next book pretty much right after I turn in the previous book. And for me, I usually get the book idea when I'm in the middle of the draft of what I'm supposed to be writing, because middles are so difficult for me. Beginnings are exciting because I don't know anything can happen, anything is possible, and they're fun to write. And ends are fun because you can see the end in sight and you're almost there and you can feel it coming together. But middles for me are so difficult and they're the most work. And so when I'm in the middle of the book, I always get the bright, shiny idea. And so they sit with me for a long time, which I think is really helpful. And that's why as soon as I turn in the book, I'm ready to go because I've been thinking about this book idea that I can't write for the last several months. And then I'm excited to kind of dive into it again.
And you've started to kind of hear those characters and you want to get to know them. And yeah, I completely empathise with that.
Which is your favorite part of the process? The writing alone in the spare room part or this part? No offense to everyone in here if this is not your favorite part.
I don't think I can choose. I mean, it's a bit like saying what's your favorite time of year kind of thing. Like there's advantages. I love starting a new project. I wish I could remember who I pinched this from, but I read an interview with a writer. I think it might have been a writer called Sadie Jones. And she said, before you start a book, it's a cathedral in your head, and on the page, it's a garden shed. It's so true. And I love that moment when it's still a cathedral, and it could be, the next great novel or whatever. But, writing the end is pretty bloody brilliant as well. And this bit is, we writers are not allowed out very often. Spend a lot of time alone in front of a screen in our pajamas, so it's very nice to get out and meet some real people.
Yeah, and I actually really love this part, like hearing other people's thoughts on the book, and because I think every reader brings something to the book as well, and it doesn't just belong to you anymore, it belongs to other people. And I love all stages of the process except middles, but I love the beginning of the book, and there's something very rewarding about having the book out in the world and being able to talk about it with other people as well.
That feeling of opening your front door and finding a box of your copies of your book is really nothing beats it. I also wanted to touch on how the genre has changed in the past 5 or so years. I think that we have all kinds of readers who maybe thought they didn't read thrillers or suspense novels before, and then we had Gone Girl, we had Girl on the Train, we had all the girl books, Luckiest Girl Alive, and I think that people have really come to these kinds of stories in a new way and in droves. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experiences with that. I know, Megan, that you started off writing young adult books. So, well, I guess what made you switch? Mm-hmm. How has it been different? And these are a lot of questions. And how have you seen the genre change since you got started?
Yeah, so I think the very process of writing young adult fiction kind of gave rise to the idea for my first adult book as well, because I was kind of looking back in hindsight at my own time in high school and seeing how these big events that happen when these kids are younger, and you think, how could that affect people 10 years later? Do they leave these events behind? Does it shape who they become? Are they ever able to escape the past? And so that was pretty much the idea for All the Missing Girls. It's an event that happened 10 years prior that comes back to haunt the characters in the present. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, the genre in thrillers and suspense feels like it's changed in that there's a lot out there right now about the everyday person thrown into this suspenseful situation for the first time. And a lot of the books that I'm loving right now, the psychological suspense novels that I'm reading, it kind of takes this close look into normal characters and normal relationships, and you kind of look around at these people around you and your neighbors, and you wonder, what are we keeping underneath the surface? So that for me is one of the big changes I've seen.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, and because I think we kind of struggle with a term, a sort of encompassing term for these types of books, and people have described mine as various different things, like grip lit, I think is one of the terms that is quite often used, but one that's often applied to my books, and I don't think it really fits, is domestic noir. And I can see why, because a lot of the books in our genre are very domestic stories. When you start out with things like Gone Girl and stuff, they start in the home, and it's a story about the home no longer being a safe place and your fears kind of being inside the house. But my books aren't really about that. Usually it's my characters kind of venturing out or going back somehow into the past. And then it's not a kind of, is my husband a killer sort of setup. So, and I think that's becoming much more of a thing. So maybe that's how I think the genre has changed most, is that it's sort of gone from being about primarily kind of husband-wife relationships into being more about the relationships with other people in our lives. I don't know.
I love that idea. I completely
I'm now thinking
agree.
of loads of examples that totally contradict what I've just said.
You both have written unreliable narrators, and I wonder how that, one of the questions that I always get asked is how autobiographical is this book? And I wonder if you are asked that question as often. Do people assume that the unreliable narrator is you? You also have written, both of you, characters who are writers. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
I definitely get a lot of people assuming that I'm my main characters, and I think that's partly because they're first-person narrators, and you're very much in their skin. But it's just small things like Nora in A Dark, Dark Wood is a runner. And I get a lot of people just assuming that I'm a runner and writing to me about running, and I don't even run for the bus, I haven't run since high school, and I've no intention in starting. And people say, but you write so wonderfully about the compulsion to exercise, and I guess that's why I'm a writer, because I find it easy to put myself in other people's shoes. But no, my books aren't definitely on autobiographical, but I think you can't inhabit a character unless you can imagine being them, and all of the fears of my characters are on some level my fears, and all of the motivations of my characters, even the more, let's say, less sympathetic ones, are me as well. They're mostly my baser impulses that I've hopefully stamped down, but I could imagine acting on in a different context. So, yeah, I'm kind of undermining my own point here, aren't I?
Not at all.
It's so true. Just going off what you were saying, I always say at the start, when people I know are reading my books especially, I'm like, it's not me.
And that's not you.
Right. No one that we know is in this book. But then, as I'm thinking about it more, I think you find bits and pieces of yourself in all the characters and all the settings, and it kind of grows from the bones of your experiences. So the start of All the Missing Girls, I mean, that long car ride is something that I myself have done. And there's a Ferris wheel on the cover of the book, and it's kind of a central part to the story. And I'm terrified of Ferris wheels. Like, that for me is a big fear. And I think I really embraced that and kind of threw my own fear into the story and used it. So I think there are, like you were saying, bits and pieces of yourself, pros and cons that make it into all the different parts of the characters in the story. But I always say it's not me.
I think that it's natural to pull those pieces of your life, those memories that stick with you for a reason that you can't quite figure out until you're sitting in front of a blank screen and you think that vision of the wreck of the building comes into your mind.
But it has to come from
and you have to write about it.
I often say to people when they say, why do you write? And there's all sorts of answers why I write, mostly because I can't not write, but my kind of flippant answer is because it's cheap therapy. And it is, all of my books explore, like In a Dark, Dark Wood is really about that fear, which I think a lot of us have, of not being believed, or of not, having. I get this thing where I wake up in the middle of the night and I start thinking about all the things that not even that I did wrong over the day, but that I might have done wrong. Like, maybe, did I run that red light? Was I flash speeding? Did I offend that person? That thing that I said, was it actually really insulting? And Nora has that kind of, writ enormously large. Her fear is that she might have killed somebody. I'm pretty sure I probably haven't done that.
I hope you don't have that fear.
But there's something quite healthy, about working through those fears in a very contained way.
Yeah, and I think that also goes really hand in hand with the idea of the unreliable narrator, because you start to question this story that you've been telling yourself about the events that you've seen or your life. Is that really how it was? Are we lying to ourselves, or is there a different way to perceive it? So
I was reading this when I was researching In a Dark, Dark Wood, which is, you know, the main character has had a car crash. So she's having memory issues, and part of her problem is that she's not sure if what she's remembering is the truth. And I read this brilliant book called The Memory Illusion, which was all about memory and how every time we recall a memory, we essentially tell ourselves the story afresh, and it's re-recorded afresh. So what you remember next time is not the true memory, it's the memory that you recalled last time, and how it gets overwritten. And I think as writers, I'm really aware of that. And I'm really aware as well of, quite often, I do this thing where I anticipate my husband saying something about something, and I have an imaginary argument in my head with him about it. And then later I find myself annoyed with my husband because of this imaginary argument. And I have to remind myself that, in fact, we never had the argument. This was all in cipher. So that's kind of, I am an unreliable narrator of my own life, so it's maybe not surprising.
I can very much relate to that. I have one final question for both of you, just a quick one. In my experience, in a room full of readers, there are often some aspiring writers also. And so I'm wondering if you can close by giving us your very best advice to somebody who is scribbling in secret right now, or not in secret.
Very best.
Nothing?
No,
I know, I'm just trying to think.
The very best advice. I mean, I think, you know, everybody has their own voice, and the things that make us different and unique are also the things that make us stand out. So it's kind of about discovering your own voice. But for me, the answer, because I didn't know anybody who was a writer when I was growing up, and I wasn't sure the path to becoming a writer, and I took a really roundabout way to becoming a writer. But I just keep going back to the idea that you just need to keep writing, and you keep reading, and that's how you discover your voice and the type of story you want to tell, and to just keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've sort of stolen my advice there, which is going to be just, you know, just do it. But I think my answer is usually find the story that you really want to tell, because I think some people are in love with the idea of being a writer, and actually the writing is only part of it. Part of it is you want to create a story that people want to read, and the answer to that is having compelling questions and a setup that people really want to find the resolution to. And if you're interested in that, I think there's a really high chance that other people will be as well. So I guess, yeah, find a character that you want to get to know, find a question that you want to answer, and just, yeah, try and get it down on paper.
I think that's excellent advice and a good place to wrap up. Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you for great questions.